Hello and welcome. This is Claire, and this is my ethical dilemmas in supervision presentation. And so before I begin, I want to clarify that due to some technical difficulties, I was not able to upload the PowerPoint while also presenting the PowerPoint at the same time. So what I have included is a link for you to have access to the PowerPoint. And so if you do not have the PowerPoint uploaded, I encourage you to do so that way you're able to follow along and comprehend to the material that will be presented to you today. And so to ensure that you're on the correct slide, I will say something such as next slide, so that way you are able to follow along with the content that I am presenting to you with this presentation. So with that being said, if you are on the very first slide, which is ethical dilemmas and supervision, you can go ahead and click to the next slide. So for this presentation, some things to consider would include an ethical dilemma relating to professional behaviors will be presented to you, as following along with some social work laws and codes that can relate to this specific ethical dilemma, a decision-making model, coaching skills as a supervisor, and cultural considerations. Next slide. So for today, the ethical dilemma that I have put together for you is this. Amanda is a 23-year-old student who is pursuing her MSW at WKU, and she is currently doing her field placement at Wilson Counseling with LCSW Kate as her supervisor. So after sitting in on a few sessions with clients, Kate feels that Amanda is ready to lead a few sessions with clients. However, while observing, Kate begins to notice behavioral patterns with Amanda. So with that, the behavioral patterns include that when working with female clients, Amanda is highly engaged, actively listens, maintains good eye contact, and maintains efficiency with case notes. However, when working with male clients, Amanda acknowledges that she is very hostile, she rolls her eyes, she crosses her arms, and she does not summarize what a male client says to show that she is actively listening. Next slide, please. So with this particular ethical dilemma, some social work laws and codes would include KRS 335.080. So with this KRS, Section 1B would be highly relevant, which includes the board shall issue a license as a certified social worker to an applicant who is a person of good moral character. And with the Code of Ethics specifically, 3 ethical standards stood out the most with this particular ethical dilemma, and those were 3.90, 3.09, which is commitment to employees. So with this ethical standard, Section D is very relevant with this ethical dilemma, which is relating to employers practicing ethical practice and taking steps to ensure following the Code of Ethics with all clients to enact effective social work practice. And then also 4.02, which is discrimination. And so with 4.02, it defines that social workers should not practice social work practice with any form of discrimination that fall onto the basis of race, sex, ethnicity, etc. And then 6.04 is social and political action. So with this particular ethical standard, sections A and C would be highly relevant towards this specific ethical dilemma, which is equal access to resources and services for all clients in needing of social work services, as well as engaging in action relating to respecting social and cultural diversity with all populations. And then one final code that can relate to this particular ethical dilemma would be 201 KAR 23080, which is the Code of Ethical Conduct. And so Section 6.2a stood out the most with this particular ethical dilemma, which states, a social worker shall not engage in a social business, or personal relationship with a student or supervisee if that relationship might impair the social worker's professional boundaries. Next slide, please. So with this particular ethical dilemma, the decision-making process that seemed the most relevant was the four force model. So the four force model is defined as making a decision is not simply a reaction to a given stimulus that leads to a particular conclusion. Rather, it also involves a potentially influenced exchange process that is much more complex than simply choosing among our alternatives. So when applying the four force model, there are 6 steps with the ethical decision-making model. And so the first step would be to identify the problem. So with this particular ethical dilemma, the problem would be Amanda practicing behaviors that may acknowledge biases towards male clients. And then the second step would be to collect information. And so collecting information with this particular ethical dilemma could include providing feedback for Amanda's practice with clients, as well as address concerns and ask Amanda to give herself some feedback on how she did with practicing with clients. And then the third step would include stating options. And so with this ethical dilemma, some options may include learning to do a self-reflection exercise with Amanda and have Amanda possibly sit on a few more sessions Kate has, more specifically with male clients. And then the fourth step would include applying ethical principles and standards. And so with that, this ethical dilemma could help Amanda reflect on the ethical standards that are in the Code of Ethics that were stated previously in the last slide. However, a specific order should probably be considered when addressing the concerns of this ethical dilemma. So with that, the order of ethical standards that should be addressed when speaking with Amanda could include 4.02 coming first, 6.04 coming second, and then 3.09 being addressed last. And then speaking with Amanda, her personal feedback when addressing these specific standards in the Code of Ethics. And then the fifth step would include making a decision. And so a decision that would probably be best for this specific ethical dilemma could include completing an exercise that involves reviewing the Code of Ethics and practicing self-reflection. And this is specifically towards Amanda, not Kate. And then the step 6, which is the final step, which would be implementing the decision. So with implementing the decision for this decision-making model, after practicing self-reflection and referring back to the Code of Ethics, Kate should probably have a follow-up with Amanda and ask what she learned from these 2 particular exercises, while also Kate, and then you also asking Amanda what she would like to do going forward, while ensuring Kate also explains what she feels would be best as well, and both Amanda and Kate coming to agreement on what they want to do with going forward and learning to overcome this specific ethical dilemma. Next slide, please. So with this ethical dilemma, the ethical principle screen, the one on the left specifically, is the exact order of the ethical principle screen, which is the protection of life, equality and inequality, autonomy and freedom, least harm, quality of life, privacy and confidentiality, and truthfulness and full disclosure. So with this particular ethical dilemma, the ethical principles that would be most relevant to least relevant, or most important to less of importance, could include equality and equality, autonomy and freedom, least harm, protection of life, quality of life, truthfulness and disclosure, and privacy and confidentiality. Next slide, please. So when it comes to coaching the employee about this particular ethical dilemma, applying an interactional model would be best appropriate. So an interactional model is defined as the supervisor mediates between the supervisee and the systems and describes educational supervision as mediating between the supervisee and the subject. And so with an interactional model, there are four steps to effectively practicing the interactional model, which includes preliminary, beginning, middle, and ending and transition. So with this ethical dilemma, the preliminary step would be noticing Amanda's behavioral patterns with male clients. And then the beginning step would include addressing the concern and relating to the concept that the behaviors could be causing an interference with effective social work practice. And then the middle could include discussing options with Amanda that could help prevent the ethical dilemma from occurring in future practice, while also asking Amanda how she feels about the situation. And even when discussing with Amanda the situation, as well as asking how she feels about this situation, the middle step should include implementing the vision of Wilson Counseling specifically, which is learn from yesterday, live for today, and hope for tomorrow. And with that being said, for the ending and transition step, this could include acknowledging to Amanda that being an intern is a learning process. And so, there's always room for growth and professional development. And even with this particular ethical dilemma and these particular behaviors, there could be a possibility that Amanda didn't realize her specific behaviors towards male clients were taking place. So with that being said, it's important to address these concerns while also implementing, being an intern is a learning process, and being an intern also requires learning to grow and learn from the experience while also becoming a professional social worker with professional development. Next slide, please. And so when it comes to encouraging growth and development, some things may include encouraging Amanda to refer back to her class material from her social work practice class. And then another thing to consider is encouraging Amanda to reflect on her personal morals and see if they may be causing an interference with her practice. And with referring back to her personal morals, this could help her begin the steps of building more professional boundaries when doing social work practice. And then one final thing to encourage is to encourage Amanda to attend weekly meetings with all the staff members at Wilson Counseling. And so this could be productive because Amanda could learn a lot from other staff members of Wilson Counseling, such as gaining a different perspective of a particular population or particular clients specifically, and how to effectively practice with particular populations that Wilson Counseling might encounter with. And then some of the dialogue to approach Amanda with the dialogue specifically, it's important to have the intention of the questions for dialogue to have motivational interviewing, so that way one can be able to gain better insight as to what Amanda thinks and feels about this particular situation. So with that being said, some of the dialogue for this particular ethical dilemma could include asking Amanda, how do you think your sessions went with your clients? Do you feel that your sessions were successful? Why or why not? Going forward, what areas do you feel that you are most comfortable with? And what areas do you feel that you need more practice on? And then how would you describe your professional behavior? So with these types of questions specifically, this could also help Amanda take the steps of self-reflection when it comes to having a more effective social work practice with her clients. Next slide, please. For cultural considerations, if a supervisee were to be a different race than me, two things that I feel would be key when having a supervisee that were a different race than me would include teaching skills relating to empathy and self-reflection. So with empathy, there are three key features of it, which include effective sharing, self-other awareness, and self-emotion. So with effective sharing, that can be that can be being mindful when working with clients and being self-reflective. And then being self-other awareness can include separating yourself from your client. So with that, self-other awareness can include the key rule that we learn in our social work education, which is once a client, always a client. And then with self-emotion, this could include learning to set aside your personal emotions and beliefs when working with clients, so that way a social worker can remain objective at all costs when working with a client. And then self-reflection specifically, the three things that are present when practicing self-reflection include awareness of thoughts, awareness of feelings, and awareness of behaviors. So with these three things, when becoming aware, social workers are learning to become more intentional with what they want to do as professionals when it comes to bettering their skills of being a social worker. And then how to change the approach if the setting was in a rural area. So with that, I would ask questions that relate to a supervisee, that relate to asking for their input on what they feel the key definitions of a rural area are. So some questions could include, what issues do you think are present within rural areas? Do you think rural areas can be strengths-based? Why or why not? What do you think is the definition of rural areas when it comes to population? And then after asking these types of questions, kind of compare and contrast like research-based characteristics to the response of my supervisees. So some of the stuff to include when comparing and contrasting would include rural areas have a population of less than 2,500 residents. Some issues related to rural areas can include geographic isolation, high rates of substance abuse, and lack of transportation. And then rural areas can be strength-based due to characteristics such as strong spiritual beliefs, altruism, which can relate to giving back to the community, and the characteristic of everybody knows everyone. Next slide, please. When it comes to if the supervisee lived in the same rural area, two key things that I would highly address with the supervisee would include aversive racism and intergroup contact theory. So with aversive racism, this applies to people who identify as politically liberal and believe themselves unbiased, but who actually hold unconscious negative beliefs about people of color and other outgroups. And so this would be relevant for Amanda's case because outgroups can relate to people of different sex and genders. And then intergroup contact theory, there are 4 characteristics that relate to the intergroup contact theory, and those are equal status, cooperative pursuit of a common goal, perceived common humanity, and mutual support of an accepted institution. And so with the intergroup contact theory, conditions relating to the more culturally immersed one becomes, research has proven that when positive attitudes were highly present, the current characteristics of intergroup contact theory were highly present. And then some specific supervision skills that I feel would be highly helpful with this particular ethical dilemma would include playing the role of an educator. And so when playing the role of an educator with a supervisee, a supervisor is ensuring the supervisee are providing ethical and clinically appropriate behaviors and services, help supervisees develop into professionals, and help supervisees how their coursework and their social work education is translated into practice. And then one final supervision skill that I feel would be highly helpful with this particular ethical dilemma would include have the skill of being caring. So with being caring, the supervisor cares about their supervisee as much as they care about their clients. And so with that being said, the supervisor is there to help their supervisee and not be too critical and judgmental, because, you know, like I said previously, being an intern is let alone a learning experience. And so with that, it's a supervisor's job to acknowledge that, as well as, you know, acknowledge the fact that there's always room for growth when it comes to your professional behaviors of becoming a professional social worker. Next slide, please. So with the conclusion, I want to ensure that the main things that I hope you got out of this presentation include, you know, social workers will always be placed in a situation where they will feel the most uncomfortable, even if they are playing the role of a supervisor. But like I previously said, there's always room to do research in order to overcome this obstacle. And then when looking at the ethical dilemma from different perspectives, one can be able to compare and contrast the steps of the decision making when it comes to overcoming this ethical dilemma. And then also two key things that I felt were highly present that I hope you were able to get out of with this presentation are self-reflection and empathy. And these can be especially helpful when following the decision-making model of the specific ethical dilemma that was presented to you today. And then the next slide is my references, and thank you. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation as much as I did presenting it.